A wealthy tourist who had traveled across the world for leisure found himself in a foreign country, fascinated by its rich culture and history. This country was known for its stunning architecture, grand palaces, and centuries-old traditions that had been carefully preserved. The tourist, used to living in luxury, was eager to explore the grand sights and feel the pride of being in a place with such deep-rooted heritage. He had spent his days visiting historical landmarks, enjoying delicious local cuisines, and admiring the beautiful artwork displayed in the galleries. One day, he made his way to a famous palace, known for its royal guards, tall, imposing figures dressed in elaborate uniforms. These guards were more than just soldiers. They were a symbol of the country's pride and respect for its long history. The tourist had seen them before in pictures and videos, but nothing compared to the sight of them in person, standing perfectly still as if they were part of the palace itself. As he wandered around the palace grounds, the tourist began to grow more curious. He watched the guards from a distance, amazed by how stoic and unwavering they were in the face of the crowds. They didn't flinch, didn't even blink. It was as if they were statues. To him, they seemed like living symbols, something that wasn't supposed to be touched or challenged. But in his mind, this thought was fleeting. What he didn't realize was that to the locals, these guards weren't just figures of decoration. They represented everything the country stood for. They were a sacred part of the heritage, just as much as the palace itself. Despite his fascination, the tourist began to feel a sense of boredom. After all, he was used to the excitement of high-end experiences and constant stimulation. As he walked around the palace, his mind wandered. The heat of the day, the steady rhythm of the guards' stillness, and the crowds around him all combined to give him a strange sense of detachment from the place. He wasn't fully immersed in the culture. Instead, he was just another visitor passing through, looking for something to entertain him. Then, an idea crossed his mind. A mischievous, almost reckless thought. What if he did something to get a reaction out of the guard? What if he broke the stillness for a moment? This wasn't just any guard. This was a symbol of control, of power, of everything that stood still while he moved through the world at his own pace. For a brief moment, it felt like the perfect challenge. A test of the guard's patience. The tourist, without giving it a second thought, decided to act on his impulse. He found a can of bright paint in one of the street vendor stalls nearby. The idea seemed harmless at first. He would pour the paint on the guard's uniform as a joke. Surely, this would be a funny story to tell later. A small act that would surely not have any serious consequences. He didn't fully understand the magnitude of what he was about to do. His arrogance and sense of privilege clouded his judgment. As he approached the guard from behind, he felt a rush of excitement, but there was also a strange unease gnawing at him. With a deep breath, he poured the paint onto the guard's uniform. The bright color splattered across the fabric, creating an image of chaos in the midst of the guard's perfectly composed appearance. The tourist grinned, expecting laughter or at least a reaction. Instead, he was met with the unexpected. The guard remained completely still. The moment stretched on, and the tourist's sense of triumph quickly began to fade. What he hadn't realized, until that very moment, was that this wasn't just any guard. This wasn't just any country. This was a living symbol of a nation's history and pride, and his careless action had just crossed a line he didn't fully understand. The moment the paint splashed onto the royal guard's uniform, the tourist's smile slowly faded. He had been expecting some sort of reaction, but the guard remained as motionless as ever, almost as though he hadn't even noticed the bright stain that now marred his once perfect uniform. The tourist stood there, his excitement quickly turning into confusion. Had the guard not seen him? Was the guard simply too disciplined to respond? Around him, the atmosphere shifted. The laughter and playful energy that had been present just moments ago began to fade. A few people nearby glanced at the tourist, their expressions shifting from casual indifference to mild surprise. Some muttered to each other, their eyes narrowing as they realized what had just happened. The tourist's confidence began to waver as he noticed the shift in the crowd's mood. People were starting to stare, and the playful environment around him felt suddenly heavy, like the air had thickened. He looked around, hoping for someone to laugh, someone to join him in the joke, but instead he saw disapproving looks. A couple of bystanders shook their heads, whispering in hushed tones. The tourist began to feel uncomfortable. For the first time, he wondered if maybe he had misjudged the situation. He glanced back at the guard, still unmoving, his posture unwavering as though nothing had happened. But it was clear to the tourist now that this wasn't just about the paint. There was something much deeper at play, something that he hadn't understood in his fleeting moment of arrogance. Before the tourist could process what was happening, a uniformed officer approached from the crowd. The officer's expression was stern, his steps purposeful as he neared the scene. The crowd that had gathered seemed to part, a clear path forming as the officer reached the tourist. There was no laughter now, only the quiet murmur of voices. The tourist felt his heart begin to race as the officer addressed him. "What have you done?" the officer asked, his voice calm but stern. The tourist opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the situation. Was this really such a big deal? It was just paint after all, just a harmless prank. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that something was very wrong. The officer didn't wait for an answer. He simply signaled to a few other guards to approach, and together they escorted the tourist to a nearby security station. As they walked, the tourist's mind began to unravel the gravity of the situation. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, their stares heavy with judgment. It was as though he had crossed some invisible line, and the consequences of his actions were beginning to dawn on him. But what could he do now? The reality of the situation was sinking in, and it was nothing like he had expected. His careless prank had turned into something much more serious, and there was no way to undo the damage he had done. Inside the security station, the tourist was asked to sit down. The officer spoke to him in measured tones, explaining the cultural importance of the Royal Guard, their role as a symbol of the country's history and national pride. Each word felt like a punch to the tourist's gut, as he realized how disrespectful and thoughtless his actions had been. What he had seen as a harmless joke was, in fact, a deep insult to the traditions of an entire nation. His stomach churned as he began to understand the weight of what he had done. The consequences of his actions were far more serious than he could have imagined. The tourist's world, which had always been one of privilege and carelessness, now seemed distant and foreign to him. It was as though he had just woken up to a harsh reality, and there was no way to escape it. As the tourist sat in the small security office, he couldn't help but replay the events in his mind over and over again. The officer's words echoed in his head. "What have you done?" He had expected some mild scolding, maybe a warning, but instead, he had been dragged into a situation far beyond his control. The weight of the consequences was sinking in, and with every passing minute, he felt more trapped in the reality of his mistake. The initial shock of what he had done was wearing off, and the true nature of his actions was becoming clearer. This wasn't just a prank. It was a violation of something far deeper, something he couldn't have possibly understood in that moment of impulsive behavior. The Royal Guard wasn't just a soldier in a uniform. They were a symbol, a living testament to the country's history and values. He had disrespected not just one person, but an entire culture and its traditions. His heart sank as he realized that his careless joke had completely shattered the respect others had for him. The police officers in the room spoke quietly amongst themselves, but the tourist couldn't make out their words. He tried to gather his thoughts, but nothing seemed to make sense anymore. He thought of the people who had been watching him, how they had reacted with shock and disapproval. He could still see their faces, their eyes filled with disappointment. He had been used to being admired, to being the one in control, but now he was the subject of scorn, and it was a feeling he wasn't familiar with. The officer who had first approached him returned to the room, now accompanied by two other men in uniform. One of them was holding a tablet, displaying images of the paint that had stained the guard's uniform. They showed him the photographs, and the tourist could see how the vibrant colors stood out against the otherwise immaculate uniform, a glaring contrast. It hit him even harder now that the guard's uniform was a cherished part of the country's heritage, something that had been passed down through generations. What had seemed like a harmless prank had now become a serious offense in the eyes of those who held their traditions close to their hearts. As the tourist was left to sit there in silence, the consequences of his actions began to take shape. His thoughts shifted to the people he would have to face when he got back to his home country. The media would no doubt cover the story. The wealthy, carefree tourist who had thoughtlessly poured paint on a royal guard would soon be the subject of countless headlines. His face would be everywhere, and the words disrespect and entitled would be attached to his name. His mind raced at the thought of the damage that would come to his reputation. The deals he had lined up, the business relationships he had nurtured, all of it would crumble in an instant. No amount of wealth or status would be enough to erase what he had done. Outside the small room, he could hear the murmurs of the crowd. People were still talking about the incident, and there was no doubt that word would spread quickly. The tourist realized that this wasn't just a local matter. It was an international one now. He had become the face of an entire story, one that would teach others a valuable lesson in respect and humility. As the officers prepared to take him to the next stage of the process, the tourist felt a wave of shame wash over him. He had never imagined that something so simple could change the course of his life. The world he had once felt so comfortable in, a world where his wealth and influence could buy almost anything, now seemed so distant. There was no way to fix this, no way to take back what he had done. All he could do now was face the consequences. The tourist was escorted from the security office to a larger room, where more officers were waiting to speak with him. His heart pounded in his chest, his palms sweating despite the cool air conditioning. He was told to sit down at a table where a few official-looking documents were laid out, but he couldn't focus on them. His mind kept racing back to the moment when he had poured the paint on the Royal Guard's uniform, as if everything that followed had been set in motion from that one careless decision. The officers began to explain the seriousness of the situation. They spoke calmly, but their words were firm. They told him that his actions had offended not only the royal family but the entire nation. He had disrupted the peace and disrespected something sacred to the people. He didn't know what to say. He had heard of people being fined for petty things, but this was on another level. His mind spun as he tried to understand just how deep his mistake had gone. As they continued, one officer mentioned that the Royal Guard's uniform was considered an emblem of national pride, not something to be treated lightly. The tourist had thought it was just a soldier's uniform, something worn to look impressive, to perform a job. But now he understood that it was more than that. It was part of the history of this country, a living representation of their traditions and culture. To stain it, to tarnish its perfection, was to disrespect the values that had been passed down for generations. A few minutes later, a local news team arrived, with cameras and reporters asking to speak to the officers involved. The tourist's stomach turned. He hadn't expected this level of attention, and the last thing he wanted was to be splashed across the news, a subject of ridicule. His impulsive mistake was now turning into a public spectacle. The officers assured the reporters that everything was under control, but the tourist could see the flashes of the cameras, the microphones that were thrust into the officers' faces. It was clear to him now that this wasn't just a local issue. It had become something that people all around the world were going to hear about. The officer who had initially detained him sat down next to him and gave him a brief moment of silence. It felt like the longest silence of his life. He wanted to say something, apologize, explain that it had all been a joke, that he never intended to hurt anyone, but nothing he could say would take back what had already happened. His mind was filled with regret. The laughter he had imagined in the beginning was nowhere to be found. There was only shame now, only the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The officer finally broke the silence. "You will need to meet with the legal team and possibly face charges for disrespecting national symbols, he said, his voice soft but serious. The tourist's heart sank. Charges. He had never imagined it would come to this. He had thought he could brush this off, maybe pay a fine or apologize, and move on. But now, as he sat there, the full scope of what he had done was becoming clear. His actions had consequences, and those consequences were not something that could be easily avoided. As he left the room to meet with the legal team, the tourist couldn't help but think of how much his life was about to change. The world he had always known, the world of luxury, of ease, where he could always count on money and influence to solve his problems, seemed distant now. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The man who had once been so carefree was now facing the reality of his choices, and there was no escaping the truth. He would have to face the full weight of the consequences. As the tourist left the security office, his mind was spinning, his thoughts clouded with regret. He had never felt so helpless, so out of control of his own fate. The officers had told him he would need to face charges, and the weight of their words settled heavily on his chest. He had made a mistake, one that, at the time, seemed so small, but now felt like it could ruin everything he had worked for. The first thing he thought about was his business. His life was built around a reputation, a brand that he had carefully cultivated over the years. He had spent countless hours negotiating deals, shaking hands with influential people, and making sure his image was one of success and sophistication. But now, as the story of his prank spread through the media, he knew it wouldn't take long for his reputation to be shattered. News outlets were already covering the story, and his face was everywhere, splashed across the headlines, accompanied by the words disrespectful and entitled. The phone calls started soon after. His assistant was the first to call, her voice tight with concern as she asked if he was okay. She explained that several of his business partners had reached out, questioning his judgment and wondering whether he was still fit to handle the important deals they had been working on. With every passing hour, more clients began to pull out, unsure if they wanted to be associated with someone who had so carelessly disrespected a foreign culture. The calls kept coming, one after the other, and with each one, the tourist could feel his world slipping further away. It wasn't just his business that was at risk. The people in his personal life began to distance themselves too. Friends who had once called him regularly, inviting him to events and parties, now seemed to disappear. They didn't want to be caught in the middle of a scandal, and so, one by one, they withdrew from him. He couldn't blame them. Who would want to be associated with someone who had made such a foolish mistake? He had always thought his wealth and status would protect him, but now he saw that those things meant little when it came to true respect and integrity. As the days passed, he began to feel the isolation creeping in. The phone stopped ringing, and his social media accounts were flooded with angry comments and criticism. People from all corners of the world voiced their disappointment in him, condemning his behavior and calling for him to be held accountable. The weight of their words hit him harder than he could have expected. He had lived a life where he was admired, where everything seemed to go his way. But now, for the first time, he was seeing the world from the other side. The side of judgment, of regret, of consequences. The legal team that had been assigned to his case advised him that he could try to settle the matter quietly, perhaps by offering a formal apology and paying a fine. But even as they spoke, the tourist knew deep down that no amount of money or words could undo what he had done. His reputation, his business, and his personal life were all at risk now, and he couldn't escape the reality of it. One evening, sitting alone in his hotel room, he thought back to that moment when he had poured the paint on the guard's uniform. He had acted on impulse, driven by a need for excitement, but now that simple decision felt like the beginning of everything unraveling. What he hadn't understood at the time was how deep the cultural divide went, how important the Royal Guard was to the people of this country. He hadn't considered the lasting impact his actions would have on both his life and their pride. It became clear to him then that there was no easy way out. No amount of money could erase the damage. The only thing left was to face the consequences and learn from this experience, no matter how painful it might be. But even that realization didn't make the situation easier. The damage had been done, and the road ahead seemed filled with more uncertainty than he had ever imagined. The days following the incident felt like they dragged on endlessly for the tourist. He couldn't escape the feeling of dread that followed him everywhere he went. Each time he checked his phone, there was more bad news, calls from his lawyer, more emails from clients pulling out of deals, and endless media coverage. The weight of the situation was starting to settle in. What had once seemed like a small mistake had spiraled into a full-blown crisis. He was now facing not only a loss of business and reputation, but the very real possibility that his mistake could follow him for the rest of his life. He spent hours sitting alone in his hotel room, staring at the city outside his window but seeing nothing. His thoughts were a whirlwind of regret. He had always thought that his wealth and status would protect him from any real consequences. But now, as he faced the aftermath of his actions, he understood just how wrong he had been. His privilege, the very thing he had always relied on, was now irrelevant. He realized he had taken it all for granted: his ability to move through the world without consequence, his assumption that money could solve any problem. But here he was, trapped by his own actions, unable to undo what he had done. The media coverage was relentless. The story had spread far beyond the borders of the country he was visiting. Online, people from all over the world were discussing his actions, many expressing their outrage at the disrespect he had shown. Comments flooded in from people who didn't know him, didn't care about his background, but were simply shocked by his thoughtless behavior. His face was plastered across every news outlet, every social media platform. The rich tourist who had poured paint on a royal guard had become the center of a global story, and not in the way he had ever imagined. One afternoon, he received a message from a former business associate. It was brief and to the point. "I think it's best if we don't continue our partnership. Another deal, another opportunity lost." He felt the sting each time he read another message or heard about another client who was backing out. His financial situation, which had once been secure, was now in jeopardy. He realized that the road to rebuilding would be long and uncertain. His family, too, had begun to distance themselves. He had always been close with them, sharing updates on his travels and business successes. But now, when he called, the conversations were short, distant, and uncomfortable. They didn't know what to say. They had seen the news, read the headlines, and though they didn't express it outright, he knew they were ashamed of him. It hurt more than he wanted to admit. He had always taken pride in being the one they looked to for support and success, but now he was the one who had let them down. As the weeks passed, the tourist found himself reflecting more deeply on his actions. He replayed that moment in his mind constantly. The moment he had poured the paint on the guard's uniform. At the time, it had seemed like a harmless joke, a silly prank. But now, he saw how deeply his actions had affected the people around him. He had disrespected not only the guard, but an entire culture, an entire way of life that he hadn't taken the time to understand. In his arrogance, he had failed to consider the importance of what he was doing, and it was that failure that had brought him to this point. He thought about the royal guard again, how he had stood there, unmoving and unwavering, while the tourist acted without a second thought. The guard, in his silence, had become a symbol of the traditions he had disrespected. The more the tourist thought about it, the more he realized that the guard wasn't just a person in uniform. He was part of something much larger, a part of a national pride that the tourist had unknowingly trampled upon. There was no easy way out of this, the tourist knew. The damage had been done, and no apology, no financial compensation, no public statement could truly undo the harm he had caused. The road to redemption was unclear, but one thing was certain: he would have to change. The person who had made that impulsive decision, the one who had thoughtlessly poured paint on the uniform, was not the person he wanted to be anymore. He realized that he would need to confront this mistake head-on, not just for the sake of his reputation, but for the sake of his own growth as a person. But as he sat alone in that room, the weight of everything he had lost pressed heavily on his shoulders. The journey ahead seemed uncertain, and the road to redemption felt like a long and lonely one. The days dragged on, and the tourist's situation grew more dire with each passing moment. His life, once filled with luxury and carefree adventures, had been turned upside down by one thoughtless action. As he sat in his hotel room, he tried to figure out how to repair the damage, but nothing seemed to make sense. The media continued to blast his name across every platform, and his phone was constantly flooded with messages, both from the press and from concerned business contacts who were pulling away. He had hoped for a quick resolution, a way to smooth things over, but it was becoming clear that there was no easy way out. One morning, as he sat at a table, staring at the mountain of messages on his phone, his lawyer reached out to him. She informed him that he had a meeting scheduled with the royal family's representatives. They were requesting a personal apology from him. The tourist was taken aback. He had always believed that a simple apology, perhaps a few words of regret, could fix anything. But the gravity of this request hit him hard. He realized that apologizing wasn't just a formality. It was necessary to show deep, sincere respect for the traditions and culture he had so carelessly insulted. He understood now that the royal family wasn't just going to let this slide. He had to confront what he had done. The meeting with the royal representatives was set for a few days later. The tourist spent those days reflecting on how he could approach the situation. He practiced his apology over and over, trying to make it sound genuine, to express how truly sorry he was for what he had done. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that no amount of rehearsed words would take away the harm he had caused. He had disrespected an entire culture, and no apology, no matter how sincere, could undo that. But he had to try. It was the only thing left he could do. When the day of the meeting arrived, the tourist was filled with a mixture of nerves and regret. As he walked into the room where he would meet with the royal representatives, he felt a deep sense of humility that he had never experienced before. His usual confidence was gone. He wasn't the wealthy, privileged person who could get by with a smile and a handshake anymore. He was simply a man who had made a mistake, and now he had to face the consequences. The representatives were polite, but their expressions were stern. They made it clear that the offense wasn't just a small matter. It was an insult to the nation's pride. They listened as he apologized, and for the first time, he realized that this wasn't just about his reputation or his business. It was about the respect that should have been given to the people and their history. He spoke honestly, his words coming from a place of genuine regret. He told them that he hadn't understood the significance of the Royal Guard, the way they symbolized something so much greater than himself. When he finished speaking, there was a long silence in the room. The royal representatives didn't immediately respond. He wasn't sure if they accepted his apology, but he knew it was out of his hands now. The meeting ended without much fanfare, and he was escorted out of the room. As he walked away, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders, but he knew the journey to redeem himself was far from over. An apology could never truly fix everything, but at least he had taken the first step in the right direction. The press coverage didn't stop after the meeting. There were still countless headlines, still messages from clients and business contacts. But something had changed inside him. He had learned the hard way that his actions had far-reaching consequences. He had been forced to confront his own arrogance, his own sense of entitlement. And though he still had much to lose, he realized that the real lesson wasn't about saving face or fixing his reputation. It was about becoming a better person. As the days passed, the tourist found himself reflecting more on his behavior. He wasn't sure what the future held, or whether his career and personal life would ever fully recover, but he understood now that true growth came from learning from his mistakes. He would never forget what he had done, and though he couldn't undo the past, he could make sure that he would never make the same mistake again. The journey to redemption wasn't easy, but it was one he would have to walk with patience, humility, and a deep sense of respect for the world around him.